Several weeks ago, I unboxed and provided an initial impression of the Bellari HA540 headphone amplifier. The 543 is a powerful amplifier in a tiny package. It's not dead silent and in fact has some audible hiss in the signal, but the amplifier has two settings. First, the 543 can be set to neutral amplification, or second, it can be set to amplify a bit more bass and mids so that flat-sounding headphones sound a little bit more pleasant. Bellari also sent me the HA540 Mark II. I've had this little tube amplifier for a while, and in the spirit of worldwide lockdown, I think we should start locking down on this amp. The 540 is $180 depending on where you get it. It's got a single tube you can roll. It has Class A amplification, and I like it. Bellari is a corporation entirely based in the United States. They hand assemble every product in their own warehouse. They ship from within the United States. Every single unit they make is checked for quality control. We're not talking about a big manufacturing plant with molds and machine-assembled parts that eventually get a human touch. This is instead people sitting at a table, picking up components and putting them together one by one. Clearly, Bellari isn't the only audio company that works like this. Wu Audio, ZMF, some Fostex, Denon, and Audeze products have a similar methodology. But Bellari isn't a big name like the others. When I got both the 540 and 543, I was impressed by their build quality. These amps are metal and heavy. They have smooth turning volume knobs and clicky buttons and dead simple operation. Open up the amplifiers and peek inside. You see clean boards, everything is laid out nicely. The 543 is a solid state amplifier. The 540 Mark II is a tube hybrid amplifier. The 540 has impressive amplification numbers. Bellari says that the amp has 332 milliwatts per side or 664 milliwatts stereo into 30 ohms. Its output impedance is 8 ohms, so it is suitable for most headphones. Bellari says that the 540 has smooth, natural analog response. Of course, the DAC and headphone pairing will add their own unique characters. For my initial impressions, I used the 540 with the RME ADI2 DAC, Allo Audio S4, and ZMF Auteur. The RME is remarkably neutral. The S4 is also a neutral headphone. And when both were plugged into the 540, I was at first a little bit confused. The 540 initially sounded very muddy with its pairing. I heard instant distortion, so I unplugged the amp and reseated the tube. I then plugged everything back again and gave the amp 5 minutes to warm up. The overwhelming muddiness and distortion was gone. In its place, I heard tube character, something that was distinctly different from the RME's sound signature alone. When I went back and forth between the RME and the 540, I could hear the alterations. The RME by itself has less emphasis in the bass, probably by 5 to 6 decibels. It also has cleaner separation of the sub-bass and mid-bass. The RME had clarity throughout. The 540 added bass emphasis and melded the sub-bass with the mid-bass. The overall frequency range lost the separation of instruments, some of the fine differences that the RME obviously had. Now, before you start frowning, I want you to hear me out. The 540's musical reproduction was precisely what you should be hoping for. You absolutely should expect noticeable differences between a tube and solid-state amp. If you cannot hear the tube alterations, then you've been had. I can think of several tube amps that claim to provide tube goodness but either do not or just barely have the tube character. The 540 thankfully provides the thicker bass and mids I hear with a lot of good tube amplifiers. Let's talk a little bit about the sound. In Want You Back by Haim, the 540 produced the vocals without harshness or sibilance. The vocals had a bit of grain that, although present on the RME alone, was slightly more emphasized on the 540. The bass and guitar melded, but the mids remained clear and easily 2 steps ahead of the mix. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 540 melded the instruments, whereas the RME by itself did not. That melding was not unpleasant since it did not cause distortion. The treble energy in the horns and brass sounded fairly close to the way it sounded on the RME. However, the RME had a bit of smoothness to the treble the 540 did not. In other words, the 540 had a slight bit of grain and a treble bump, possibly by a few decibels. This, of course, could have been because of imperfect volume matching, so take that with a grain of salt. When I switched to the ZMF Auteur, I got a different sonic character than I did with the Olo S4, and this was to be expected. With the Olo in the chain, the music was close to neutral. With the Auteur, the songs had more bass emphasis and the treble was slightly more rolled off. The Auteur is not as neutral as the Olo and has the ZMF twist on the sound signature. Regardless, the 540 played nicely with both headphones. I never got the impression that the 540 was incompatible with the tuning of either headphone, rather that it added a bit of difference which may or may not be to someone's tastes. The icing on the top is that I couldn't find any channel imbalance. Starting off just barely past mute all the way to loud for each headphone, the channels were fully balanced, and this was true for both the 1/4 inch and 3.5mm outputs. By contrast, pricey amps like the Klipsch Heritage, which cost $500, has a huge, noticeable, and unforgivable problem with channel imbalance. The HA540 Mark II was able to drive the notoriously difficult to power Modhouse Argon. Around 12 o'clock on the volume knob, the Argon seemed plenty loud to me. The problem, however, is that the Argon are a dark-sounding headphone to begin with, and the 540's sonic character really didn't go well with the Argon. The Argon's bass emphasis and slam just sounded muddy and blunted. I tried increasing volume, but the Argon simply got too loud for me. It is entirely possible that other Argon owners might find this combination pleasant. I, on the other hand, will stick with solid-state amp pairings with the Argon. The 540 has a singular tube. Bellari uses the 12AX7 tube. I interviewed Justin Allen from Bellari a few months ago and we talked about the tube choice. He mentioned that Bellari bought out the stock of the particular tube that the 540 has. He stated that the tube the amp comes with pairs particularly well with the amplifier, and Bellari chose it on purpose based on sound. But of course, you can roll the tube if you want. Bellari suggests 12AX7, ECC83, and 5751 variants. You can find other options from various manufacturers and could spend a long time testing every tube possibility. But Bellari believes that the tube they included has a lush sound. Well, maybe. What may be lush for one person is going to be different for another. How I define lush is going to be different from somebody else. I think of lush as smooth, and the 540 stock tube is not that, at least not when compared to the lushest tube amp that I have. And that lush tube amp is the Wu Audio WA7 Fireflies. Yes, very different demographics and sound signatures, I admit. But that goes to prove my point. Amorphous lingo is just that, subject to amorphous interpretations amongst different people. The bottom line is that the 540's tube sounds like a tube. Those who think that a singular tube in a circuit cannot make a significant difference may be correct in many respects with other products. But the 540's implementation of the one and only tube is incredibly well done. I briefly compared the 540 to the Loxi P20, which has two 6N3 tubes, and to be honest, the P20's double tubes didn't provide double the tube sound. And frankly, in my opinion, the 540 seemed to have that tube character that the P20 just didn't quite reproduce. Bellari is among a handful of companies that I genuinely like for many reasons. It's not just my personal preference for a product. I try not to let that be the driving force behind recommendations. A product I like, someone else might very much dislike. I therefore try to make recommendations based on an overview. The 540 Mark II is a worthy tube hybrid amplifier in a tiny package. It's double the price of the Loxi P20 and about $100 cheaper than the Dark Voice 336 SE. I don't quite know how all these three stack up, or if any of them can really compete for the same space, but I'm eager to find out. Bellari admits that the 540 isn't cheap, and I agree. But if the Bellari performs noticeably different from the 50% cheaper Loxi P20, then the 540 might be worth the extra cost. I spoke with Justin Allen today. He informed me that Bellari is still open for business despite the COVID-19 lockdowns. If you're interested in any of their products and wish to buy them directly from Bellari, you'll get them made and shipped from within the United States, and probably without much delay.